Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So, think about the dashboard of your car for a second.
Okay, the dashboard.
Right, you know that feeling when the gas gauge has just dropped way below the red line?
Oh, yeah, and the low fuel light has been glaring at you for, like, 20 miles.
Yes. And you are just hoping to coast into a station before the engine sputters out. Well, apply that to your own life.
That is a harsh reality check.
It is, right. But have you ever felt like you are running on absolute zero? Like you look at the demands of your day, the relational friction you are dealing with, the expectations weighing on your conscience?
And you realize the internal tank has completely bottomed out.
Spot on. There is no hidden reserve. There is no secondary fuel cell kicking in. You are completely, totally out of strength.
And if you are nodding your head right now as a listener, you are going to want to hear this one.
Definitely. For our deep dive today, we are opening up a rather astonishing piece of source material. We are looking at a sermon preached in 1891 by Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
It is a fascinating one.
It really is. The title is The Best Strengthening Medicine, and he bases the whole message on a tiny, almost hidden phrase from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 34.
Out of weakness we're made strong.
That is the one. Our mission today is to take a very close look at the counterintuitive reality Spurgeon presents here.
Right. We are going to unpack the idea that admitting total, absolute inability is the required prerequisite for obtaining any genuine capability.
Which is wild because that text completely upends modern self-help philosophy.
Oh, totally. The prevailing cultural narrative, the one we are fed from childhood, tells us to dig deeper.
Right, look inside yourself.
Yeah, it says you need to find the hidden potential inside yourself to manifest your own reality through sheer willpower and positive thinking.
But Spurgeon's thesis goes in the absolute opposite direction.
Completely opposite. He does not tell anyone to look inward for a spark of greatness. He insists that we must look entirely outside of ourselves.
So in this framework, weakness is not just like a temporary lapse in an otherwise stellar performance record.
No, not at all. Weakness is the baseline human condition.
And accepting that requires a massive shift in how we view our own resources, right? And how we approach our daily struggles.
Absolutely.
Let us get right into that baseline, because Spurgeon organizes the Christian life into two distinct camps of duty.
He does. He says we are called to doing and to suffering.
Right. And to illustrate this, he uses a military analogy. He compares believers to soldiers on a battlefield.
Okay, so on one side, you have warriors out on the field of conflict, right? Engaged in active duty, charging the enemy line.
Exactly. I mean, yes, precisely. And on the other side, you have sentries stationed in the box of patience, bearing up under trial, just holding their post.
They are both vital roles, obviously. But they require entirely different types of endurance.
So true. And Spurgeon makes a very keen observation about these two types of soldiers. He notes that patience is actually a rarer grace than zeal.
That is so interesting. A lot of people can labor relentlessly on the active battlefield without growing weary.
Well, because when you are doing something active, the adrenaline is pumping, right?
Yeah, the objective is clear, and the physical action itself provides a sort of momentum that keeps you going.
But take that same active warrior, pull them off the front lines, and place them in the sentry box of suffering.
Tell them they simply have to wait.
Right. Wait, endure, and bear up under a trial without being able to fix it. And they immediately fall into impatience.
Because suffering without complaining is a vastly harder task than working with enthusiasm.
It really is.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how we naturally approach this, and an analogy came to mind.
Oh, let's hear it.
Well, we often treat faith like a performance-enhancing substance.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Like, we think of ourselves as athletes who are already fairly healthy, well-trained, and capable.
Yeah.
We just need a little extra boost from God to win the race or break a record.
Like a spiritual steroid or something.
Right. But reading through the source text, he describes faith much more like life support for someone who possesses absolutely nothing but weakness.
That is a stark contrast.
Yeah, we are not capable athletes needing a vitamin supplement. We are entirely dependent patients needing a ventilator to breathe for us.
That analogy hits the mark perfectly. Spurgeon makes the explicit claim that weakness is all we possess. It meets us everywhere we turn.
It really does.
He says that if we want to achieve anything worthy of being listed in the roll of the nobles of faith, we must rely entirely on strength from above.
We bring the weakness,
Yeah.
God brings the strength.
Precisely. This is not a partnership of equals where we meet God halfway.
No, it is a relationship of total dependence.
And without that divine strength, even the most basic tasks of the Christian life become impossible mountains to climb.
Okay, so if we are operating from this baseline of total inability, how does this actually play out in the real world?
Good question.
Let us look at the first realm Spurgeon identifies, which he calls holy doing. He starts with the simple act of obedience.
And he makes it clear that true obedience is agonizingly difficult. He does not sugarcoat it at all.
Not one bit.
Spurgeon states that true obedience goes directly against the grain for proud flesh and blood. By our very nature, we love our own will.
We love to chart our own course, right? To be the captains of our own souls.
Yes, subjecting ourselves completely to the law of the Lord, loving him with all our heart, soul, and mind, is not something we will ever do through our own natural inclinations.
Because we are ingrained rebels.
Exactly. Yes, spot on. Obeying God requires a submission that our natural disposition aggressively fights against at every single step.
He uses this brilliant nautical imagery to explain the friction of that rebellion.
Oh, the sailing metaphor.
Yeah, he says that if you chart a course to follow God, you will quickly find that the current of the world does not run that way. The wind is dead against you.
You are not going to coast into obedience.
Not at all. Every inch of forward progress will require intentional effort against the prevailing environmental conditions.
And those environmental conditions come with a high social cost.
They really do. Spurgeon lists the specific friction points a person will encounter.
Right. He says if you choose the right course, it will likely involve the loss of money, the loss of physical ease, or the loss of personal honor.
You run the risk of being labeled a fanatic.
Or being mocked as a hypocrite, or being entirely despised as a fool. The world does not reward true biblical obedience. It penalizes it.
Wait, hold on a second. Let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Shouldn't basic human psychology and willpower be enough to get past people calling you a fanatic?
You would think so?
Like, if someone is thoroughly convinced of their principles, why do they need supernatural intervention just to handle some social friction? Cannot sheer human resolve and philosophical conviction carry you through the fear of ridicule?
Well, if we follow Spurgeon's logic, the answer is a definitive no.
Why not?
Because he argues that human nature is fundamentally driven by self-love.
Okay.
And the self-love creates an intense craving for a good name, for social validation, and a massive unwillingness to be ostracized by our peers.
So we just naturally cave to the pressure.
Right. Without supernatural faith, a person facing that kind of severe social pressure will naturally, inevitably slide from their integrity to find a smooth, pleasing road.
They will rationalize a compromise to relieve the pressure.
Yes. Faith is the mechanism that allows a person to stand firm and say, God commands, and he will recompense me.
It allows a person to set their face like a flint against the wind.
Not because they do not care about the pain of ridicule, but because their trust in God overrides their natural self-love.
Wow, that is a harsh assessment of human willpower.
Yeah.
But it rings true when you look at how easily people fold under peer pressure.
It really does.
And it's fascinating how this individual obedience bleeds straight into our daily interactions with others. Spurgeon moves from the internal battle of the will right into family dynamics.
He claims we are either blessing or cursing the people in our households based entirely on where we draw our strength.
That is a heavy statement.
Very. He draws on biblical history here, citing Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph as men who left legacies of benediction for their families.
But the crucial point is that they could only bless others because they had faith in God themselves.
Right. You cannot impart a spiritual blessing using natural human strength. You cannot guide others out of the bondage of sin if you are relying on your own cleverness or moral superiority.
He gives one of those vivid images in the text when talking about a wife with an ungodly husband.
Oh, this part is striking.
He warns her against trying to change her husband's heart through her own human effort. He says attempting to do that is like trying to catch Leviathan with a hook.
Catch Leviathan with a hook. Think about that.
It is crazy. You are dealing with a massive, untamable sea monster, and you are standing on the shore with a tiny fishing pole. It is an exercise in total futility.
That image perfectly captures the absurdity of trying to change a human soul through manipulation, nagging, or psychological tactics.
The human heart is the Leviathan here.
Precisely. Spurgeon then extends this warning to parents dealing with unruly or defiant children.
What does he say to them?
He points out that parents can do serious mischief by relying on their own behavioral methods. One parent, relying on their own natural affections, might become far too indulgent, thinking love means no boundaries.
And the other side of that.
Another parent, relying on their own natural sense of order, might become far too severe, breaking the child's spirit.
So what is the solution?
The solution is taking the children to God, recognizing that the wisdom and strength to head a household correctly must come as a divine gift placed into the open hand of faith.
I also noticed the advice he gives to a young person entering an ungodly workplace for the first time.
Oh, that is such a perilous moment in life.
It really is. He says that if this young person starts compromising, like if they try to trim their sail to the wind just a little bit, showing hesitation or shamefacedness about their beliefs, that tiny compromise ripens into apostasy.
You cannot just blend in for a while and hope to emerge strong later.
No. To illustrate the danger of that early compromise, Spurgeon uses a specific historical reference from Psalm 78. He mentions the children of Ephraim.
Yeah.
The biblical text says they were fully armed and carrying bows, they had all the equipment necessary for battle, but they turned back in the day of conflict.
Because they showed cowardice at the starting line, they could never be relied upon again in the time of war.
Exactly. Spurgeon is warning the youth that a faith beginning with equivocation cuts out a terrible pattern for the rest of life. If you hide your colors on day one, you will likely keep hiding them.
It is intensely practical advice. But what is so interesting is that Spurgeon claims there is a specific action required to make any of this obedience or family leadership happen.
Right, he introduces the act of prayer, and he holds it in the highest possible regard. He calls prayer the leverage that moves the universe.
His phrasing is wonderful here. He quips that he would rather be a master of the art of prayer than an MA of both universities.
I love that line. He views prayer not as a religious formality or like a mindfulness exercise, but as the actual deployment of almighty forces.
But he places a massive condition on this. Prayer without faith is vanity.
Okay, so what about the person listening right now who feels like their prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling?
That is a very real struggle.
Right. They are trying to pray, but they feel entirely weak in the very act of praying. Their knee feels out of joint, much like the biblical story of Jacob wrestling the angel.
Well, Spurgeon addresses that exact feeling of spiritual exhaustion. He says that out of this specific weakness in prayer, you can only be made strong by faith.
How does that actually work, though?
He explains the underlying logic of why faithful prayer works. God has made promises in his word. If a person pleads those promises in faith, God cannot refuse to hear them.
Because to refuse a believing prayer would be to falsify his own word and change his own character.
Spot on. Since God's character is immutable, meaning it cannot change, an impossibility is created. God cannot ignore faith.
So faith is the thing that confirms those feeble knees and allows the weak person to take hold of the leverage that moves heaven and earth.
Yes. That shifts the burden off of our eloquence and onto God's character.
And we really need that leverage, especially when Spurgeon transitions to talking about confronting ingrained habits and lingering sin. He uses some heavy, dark imagery here.
He really does. He describes men who are sunk 1,000 fathoms deep in black, filthy waters.
These are people imprisoned in dark caves of habit addictions, raging tempers, behaviors that seem impossible to break.
The analogies he uses to describe how sin clings to us are visceral.
What does he use?
Well, he mentions the fabled tunic of Hercules, a mythological garment that could not be torn away but literally burned into the hero's flesh and bone.
Ouch. That is an intense image.
And he compares lingering sin to a chased-away dog that keeps returning to its former master's door, constantly waiting for a chance to get back inside.
Just lurking there.
Right. And then he even uses the image of the massive upas tree.
Oh, the upas tree. For context, the upas tree is a legendary tree from Java that was said to be so toxic it killed all plant and animal life for miles around it.
Yeah, so Spurgeon is painting a picture of sin as a heavily entrenched, highly toxic, almost inescapable force in human life.
And he insists that human resolve might conquer a specific sin for a short time. But human resolve is not a sin killer.
No, it is not. You might trim the branches of that upas tree with willpower, but the toxic roots remain in the soil.
He says the only axe that can actually cut down the upas tree is the blood of the Lamb. The atoning sacrifice of Christ is the only instrument that kills the root of the issue.
This raises an interesting point about how different sins die, too. Spurgeon notes from his pastoral experience that certain sins, like the habit of blasphemy or taking oaths, are often the first to die.
They are, in his words, shot through the head by true repentance and faith.
Yes. The person turns to the Lord and suddenly the urge to curse is completely gone. But other sins.
The intensely ingrained habits of the heart.
Right. The subtle prides and long-standing coping mechanisms, they die very hard. They require a prolonged, faithful application of that divine acts.
It is a grueling process, demanding total reliance on the Spirit to overcome what human effort cannot.
Okay, so having tackled that massive internal battle with sin, let us look at how this weakness translates into external action.
Specifically, Spurgeon talks about the daunting task of sharing your beliefs with others. We have all been there.
Oh, definitely.
You feel this intense desire to say a good word to a neighbor or a friend, but suddenly you are possessed by what he calls a dumb spirit.
Yes, you stammer, you drift into talking about the weather.
And you walk away feeling like you made a total failure of the interaction.
That fear of speaking is universal. We mistakenly believe that God requires our eloquence, our sharp arguments, and our flawless delivery to change someone's mind.
We think our intellectual strength is what will convince them.
But Spurgeon counters this with a story to prove that God actually prefers to use our weakness.
The story of the bearish neighbor. This is such a memorable anecdote in the text.
Let's hear it.
Spurgeon tells of a man who is very coarse, very stiff-necked, and completely hostile to religion. He answered all appeals with rude, grumbling remarks. But one morning, his neighbor comes to his door very early, weeping. The neighbor says he was awake all night, crying over the bearish man's soul, terrified that he might die without hope.
And how does the bearish man react?
True to form, he rudely dismisses him and tells him to mind his own business.
But the story does not end there, right?
No. The bearish man goes back to his forge, and he tells his wife that while he can easily defeat the arguments of the local parsons, his neighbor's tears have completely beaten him.
Wow. He is overwhelmed by the realization that someone else's heart is breaking for him.
Exactly. Yes, that is spot on. Out of a mixture of pity for his neighbor's perceived weak-mindedness and an awakened conscience, he goes to hear the preaching of the word and is converted.
The lesson of that breakdown is so clear. The neighbor did not have a polished theological argument. He had a breakdown in speech fueled by genuine earnestness.
God took that absolute weakness, a weeping, stammering neighbor, and used it as an instrument in his mighty hand.
It achieved more than the most polished rhetoric ever could.
And that principle applies not just to sharing beliefs with a hostile neighbor, but to defending the truth against cultured mockers.
Right. Spurgeon brings up the scenario where friends or colleagues mock you for holding what they call a worn-out creed, or they accuse you of being behind the age in a world of scientific progress.
That is a massive conceptual hurdle. When you are being mocked by intellectuals, your natural instinct is to bristle up.
You want to fight back.
Yeah. You want to prove that you are just as smart, just as widely read, and just as capable of delivering a sharp rebuttal.
But Spurgeon warns against relying on that defensive instinct.
What does he suggest instead?
To explain how we should handle this, he unpacks a military analogy regarding God's timing at the Red Sea.
Oh, this is so good.
He says that if humans had been in charge of the Israelites leaving Egypt, we would have executed a preemptive strike.
We would have snuck into the Egyptian camps and taken the wheels off Pharaoh's chariots before they ever left the gates.
Yes, we would have stopped the threat immediately to avoid the anxiety of being chased into the wilderness.
That is precisely what we would do. It is like playing a game of chess and wanting to win the match on the third move just to avoid the agonizing stress of steering through the mid-game.
That is a great way to put it. We want the threat neutralized before it can even form. But God's strategy at the Red Sea was entirely different.
What was his strategy?
His strategy was to let the Egyptians pursue the Israelites all the way into the very depths of the sea. He allowed the enemy to feel victorious, to seem to triumph.
So that their presumption placed them precisely where they would be, permanently and entirely crushed.
Yes. The destruction was so complete that the Israelites never had to fear the Egyptian army again.
And Spurgeon applies this to the intellectual and cultural enemies of the truth, doesn't he?
He does. God often allows error to proceed, to gain traction, and to seem like it is winning the day. He does this so that when the error collapses under its own weight and his divine judgment, it is permanently defeated.
So our job in our witness is not to panic and try to fix it ourselves, but to wait on God's timing.
Right. Waiting for God's timing while error seems to be winning requires an immense amount of endurance.
And that bridges us perfectly into the second half of Spurgeon's text, patient suffering.
moving from the active battle to the sentry box we discussed earlier.
Yeah. He starts by discussing the chronic sufferings of the daily grind.
He paints a stark picture of daily poverty and the struggle for existence in a massive city like London in the late 19th century.
The physical and economic toll on the working class was staggering.
He uses the biblical imagery of feet like fine brass burning in a furnace to describe the chronic, inescapable pressure of simply trying to survive the week.
He also brings up the visceral horror of physical agony. He mentions the surgeon's lancet.
And remember, this is 1891. Anesthetics and surgical procedures were rudimentary and terrifying. The instruments themselves looked grim.
But he tells a story of a patient who took the doctor's case of surgical instruments and filled them with roses.
What an incredible act of defiance against despair.
It really is. That image of the roses is a brilliant illustration of divine comfort.
Spurgeon contrasts two ways of handling severe physical or emotional pain. The worldly way is to seek the intoxicating cup to numb the pain, or to rely entirely on friends who, frankly, cannot steer through those lonely seas of suffering with you.
Right, because no friend can actually feel your physical agony.
Exactly. The spiritual way is to see even diseases as a chariot, bringing benedictions from Jehovah Rophi, the Lord that healeth thee.
It is recognizing that God is holding that lonely sea of suffering in the hollow of his hand.
But suffering takes many forms, obviously. Spurgeon observes the changing face of persecution.
He has this acute historical awareness. He points out that Christ conquered Caesar, so believers are no longer being thrown to roaring lions in the Roman amphitheater.
The state-sponsored execution of Christians in that specific public manner was over for his audience.
But the enmity against God has not disappeared.
Yeah.
It has simply found a meaner, more hidden mode of torture.
Spurgeon identifies the modern arena of persecution as the living room.
The living room.
Yes. It is the jeering husband, the scoffing youth, the relentless taunts from ungodly relatives. He calls this secret martyrdom.
That is heavy.
There are no crowds cheering your bravery. It is just a daily, exhausting barrage of unkindness from the people who should love you most.
Yet Spurgeon encourages these secret martyrs by telling them that angels are the spectators to their endurance, and Christ himself suffers in them.
That concept of secret martyrdom is really intense. But while physical pain and social rejection are tough, Spurgeon identifies a cerebral affliction that can be even more debilitating.
You were talking about the assault of unbelief and internal darkness.
Yes. He lists the intellectual threats of his day, specifically naming men like Huxley and Tyndall.
For context, Thomas Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog for his aggressive defense of evolutionary theory.
And John Tyndall was a prominent physicist who argued for a purely naturalistic view of the universe.
Right. In the late 19th century, these men were the titans of skeptical science, actively trying to strip the supernatural out of the public consciousness.
Furthermore, adding to that, Spurgeon notes that modern divines, theologians within the church, were spreading infidelity, alongside the coarser blasphemy found in the streets.
Spurgeon gives a very specific warning about how to engage these intellectual assaults. He says, "Do not use the wooden sword of your own reasoning to try and answer every quibble on the spur of the moment."
He bluntly admits that no single human brain is capable of answering every objection that another human brain can raise.
If you rely on your own intellect, you will eventually be beaten.
So instead of the wooden sword of human logic, he insists on relying on the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God.
You take the defensive ground of saying, "Let God be true and every man a liar."
Yes, you do not have to untangle every scientific or philosophical knot presented to you. Your strength in those mental conflicts comes from an absolute childlike reliance on the revelation of God, not your own apologetic prowess.
That shifts the burden of proof entirely off our shoulders. But the internal darkness Spurgeon addresses goes even deeper than intellectual doubt.
He transitions into a raw, remarkably honest discussion about mental depression.
He uses this incredibly evocative description. He says some people are born on a foggy day, and they swallow so much of that fog that it shades their spirit forever.
It is a striking admission from a man known for his booming voice and massive global influence.
He admits to envying those who live in the cool, sequestered vale of life. People who never experience intense emotional highs because they also never experience the crushing, despondent lows.
He recognizes that mental depression is a genuine, agonizing affliction for many believers.
So what is his antidote to the fog? He does not offer a quick fix or a cheerful platitude.
No, he says the cure is a stubborn faith that God is the same whether you sing or sigh.
He uses geographic metaphors from the Bible to explain this,
Yep,
right?
he does. He says God's character does not change whether you are standing in the sunlight on Tabor's summit, which references the Mount of Transfiguration where Christ's glory was revealed.
Or hiding in the shadows of the Vale of Baca, which references a valley of weeping mentioned in the Psalms.
Your safety is based on being in the city of refuge, not on whether you currently feel ill or well in your mind.
This brings us to the absolute climax of the text, where Spurgeon illustrates how this internal suffering can be leveraged for the sake of others.
He tells a story from his own pastoral experience that just ties it all together.
He was preaching on Christ's cry from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And as he preached, he felt an awful, terrifying darkness fall over his own spirit.
He felt a visceral sense of being abandoned by God, and he could not figure out why. He searched his conscience for some hidden sin, but found nothing.
He steps down from the pulpit, enveloped in this horrific gloom, and he goes into the vestry.
And there, waiting for him, is an elderly man who is on the very verge of total insanity.
The man is suffering from the very same horror of great darkness, feeling completely forsaken by God.
This is where the providence of God becomes clear. Spurgeon realizes in that moment why he had to experience that sudden, terrifying depression.
Because he had just been in the same miry clay.
Yes. He was able to sit down with this man, understand his terror perfectly, and guide him back to peace.
If Spurgeon had been in a state of joyful exuberance, he never would have been able to connect with a man teetering on the edge of madness.
That dynamic is staggering.
The best guide to help you out of a deep, dark pit is not the guy standing at the top shouting instructions down at you while enjoying the sunshine.
No, the best guide is the one who has been dropped into the darkness with you, who sits side by side in the mud and lends you a hand because his eyes have already adjusted to the dark.
Spurgeon's weakness, his sudden bout of depressive terror, was the precise instrument God used to save that elderly man's mind.
Synthesizing Spurgeon's closing arguments, he connects all of these highly individual experiences.
The obedience, the family dynamics, the prayer, the evangelism, the physical pain, the mental fog.
Right. He connects it all back to a massive global scale. He makes the bold declaration that this kind of absolute reliance on God is the only thing that can save the church, the nation, and the individual.
Human strength, political maneuvering, and intellectual posturing will fail.
Admitting our total weakness and relying entirely on the strength of God is the only medicine that actually works.
That brings us right back to you, the listener. We've covered a lot of ground today, but the core mechanism we have discussed is shockingly simple.
Your weakness is not a barrier to your usefulness. Your weakness is the required raw material for it.
God is not looking for your strength. He has plenty of his own. He is asking for your weakness so he can display his capability.
Think about that internal gauge reading absolute zero.
What if the specific weakness you are currently begging God to remove, that physical ailment, that difficult relationship, that mental fog, that stammering tongue, what if that is the instrument he plans to use to display his strength in your life?
That is something to sit with for a while.
It really is. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.